How's it going, Rebel fans? I'm Ryan Staker. This is the Rebellion Podcast. So I'm actually recording my second episode today. Yeah, that's a first for me, right? I'm getting after it today. Though I'm supposed to be doing housework, and my wife doesn't know that I'm doing this instead, so that's probably not going to go over well, but it's all good, right? Okay, so today's episode is the top 10 players since 2010. The 10 best UNLV men's basketball players to put on the scarlet and gray uniform since 2010, right? Why am I doing it back from 2010? You know, there's a lot of reasons, but put simply, I can put more effort into it, get it more accurate if I just go off of a smaller pool of players. And these are players that were so recent, I remember watching them up close, obviously quite recently. So it made it a little bit easier to make this list, but I do think I am going to put a top 10 list from each decade. And so I'll start off with the most recent decade, right? So top 10 players since 2010. First, though, I want to talk about, I've kind of been obsessed with something really random lately. I've been obsessed with learning about the Titanic, the ship that sank in 1912, and there was a very popular movie about it in the 90s. Yeah, I've been going down this rabbit hole. So it started with, I saw this YouTube video that it wasn't on YouTube. It was on Facebook. It just popped up, and it was Titanic survivor's story, interview from 1993. So this lady, Eva Hart, has an interview on YouTube where she talks about surviving the Titanic, and it's really interesting. She's like an incredible storyteller. And so she was, I believe, 7 years old when the ship sank, and she tells her story of everything that happened and how her mom was just super paranoid about the whole thing, and she just had a bad feeling about being on that ship, which is kind of crazy to think about. And so she would stay up all night long and then sleep during the day because of this. And then when the ship hit the iceberg, it was kind of like a thump. It wasn't super obvious that that something bad happened. So most people just didn't think anything of it. It was kind of just a slight thump. And then Eva's mom woke up everyone, and then they rushed to the deck because she just knew something wasn't right. That ended up saving their lives, because had she not, and they all would have just went back to sleep, they almost definitely would have perished, unfortunately. So she tells her whole story of how that happened. And one thing that was really interesting is she saw the ship snap in half. She saw it, she watched it. And then for years and years and years, people were telling her she was wrong, or her memory was wrong, or she thinks she saw that. They were actually arguing with her, no, the ship didn't snap in half. That didn't happen. So they didn't believe her, even though she was there and she saw it, right? And it wasn't until they finally found the Titanic many years later that she was proven right. So how they found the Titanic was actually a really interesting story. There's a lot of YouTube videos talking about it. There's a documentary that's by James Cameron that is an hour and a half long that gets into real detail. But so it was discovered in 1985 after years and years and decades of trying to find it. It was really difficult, but they finally did it, right? So what they did is they used advanced technology, because they didn't have the technology to find the ship, years previous to that, right? Originally, it was thought that the ship was at 300 feet below the surface of the ocean. So, explorers wanted to get there and dive down there and get some of the stuff that was in the ship. But then they found out that it was actually 12,000 feet. And at that time, there was no technology in the world that can get you that deep. But by the time the 80s, they had that technology. And what they did was they created two different devices, one being the Argo, which is a deep-towed sonar and video camera system that it just scanned the ocean floor for debris. And then the Angus, which is it's an underwater device that surveys everything on the ocean floor. And so by using these devices, they were just scanning the areas of the ocean floor at 12,000 feet below the surface. And they came up with the theory that if the ship did in fact break in half, like Eva Hart said it did, there should be tons of debris everywhere. And based off of looking at submarines that sank and broke, they kind of studied how the debris field would look. Okay, so once they were scanning the bottom of the floor with cameras, they started seeing objects on the floor of the ocean that were clearly man-made objects, right? And at that point, they knew they were getting close. And then eventually, they did find the Titanic, and it was a massive discovery. It was a huge celebration, huge win, and they wanted to bring stuff up from the Titanic, out of the ocean, to learn and study and understand more about what happened on that day. But because of there was efforts to kind of reserve it and keep it under the ocean, because that was basically a grave site for so many people that lost their lives. They weren't able to bring up the ship or anything inside of the ship, but they were allowed to bring up anything in the debris field. So they brought up thousands and thousands of items in the debris field from the Titanic. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff, including various items from the ship's interior, such as china, glass, metal fragments, personal belongings that were owned by people, like jewelry, clothing, even like furniture pieces. And what they did is they brought all this stuff up, and they had restoration experts very carefully, clean the items and kind of. They had to be very careful because putting them in the air after being under the ocean for 100 years could destroy them. So they had to have these experts come in and clean everything up, and so that you can see it and make it look presentable, I guess you could say. And so all of these items are actually in the museum at the Luxor here in Las Vegas, as well as a giant piece from the ship that they found and brought up, and they restored that as well. And it's really incredible. So if anyone is interested in the Titanic at all, like, definitely go check out this museum at the Luxor. It's a pretty incredible story. The whole everything involving the Titanic is really interesting. Okay, so let's get into today's subject. Top 10 UNLV men's basketball players since 2010. So making this list was difficult because, first of all, there's so many good players, but there just wasn't obvious standouts, right? It wasn't like we had players that dominated at UNLV and then went to the NBA and dominated. We had a lot of good players, and it was really hard to figure out where to put certain players, right? And so the way I made this list to try and make it as accurate as possible is I looked at their talent level, and then I looked at how experienced they were, how good of a player they were at UNLV, right? So it's not just looking at talent, but also I got in depth into advanced statistics, right? So I actually put a little effort into making this list and try and make it as accurate as possible. But it's important that we establish the difference between talent and how good of a player you are. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Talent is essentially how high your ceiling is. It's all the physical tools you were born with, that you were gifted with. And then the players that have the most tools to work with, so to speak, determines what your talent level is, what your potential is, right? So players that got drafted in the NBA, they were drafted out based off potential. That doesn't necessarily mean they were a better college player than some of these other guys I'm going to talk about who never really had a chance to play in the NBA but were very good. Hopefully that's kind of making sense. So I tried to base my list off of that. So I looked at how talented they were. I looked at their stats. I also looked at their advanced stats. This list changed a lot based on diving deep into advanced stats, because there was players that I definitely would have had on this top 10, but after going in depth into the advanced statistics, I realized, okay, they weren't as good as I thought they were. I'm also not basing it off of a career. I'm not basing it off of, how good they were after UNLV. I'm basing it off of how good they were for whatever their best season was. So let's say I'm putting a team together to try and take down, I don't know, Duke. I don't know, some really good team. And I get to pick any player I want from 2010 till present. And I go back into a time machine and I pick them out of whatever season was their best. That's kind of how I'm basing this list off of, just so there's no confusion. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my honorable mention picks. And these picks are going to make people like, huh? I feel like those shouldn't be honorable mention. I feel like those should be in the top 10. Well, I'm going to explain to you why I have them honorable mention and not into the top 10. Okay, and it was really difficult because honestly, you could put 7 through 10 and these honorable mention picks really in any order, and I wouldn't have a problem with it. Okay, the top 6, though, I feel like, in my opinion, there's not much debate on. But so the first honorable mention I have is Rashad Vaughn. Very talented player, first round draft pick, averaged 17 points per game as a true freshman. Definitely an electrifying player. His NBA career didn't pan out, unfortunately. I think it was just he just couldn't defend, and he was athletic, but his athleticism wasn't enough to overcome his defensive liability. So yeah, didn't have a good NBA career, but he had a fantastic freshman year at UNLV. Very good player. The next honorable mention I have is Bryce DeJean-Jones. Again, another very talented player that if this list was the top 10 most talented players since 2010, both Rashad Vaughn and Bryce DeJean-Jones would be towards the top of the list. I mean, these guys were very, very talented. Bryce was an ultra competitor. He got in fights. Didn't get along with people all the time because he wanted to win so bad. And I have so much respect for him because of that. He was kind of wild. He didn't always play under control, but before he unfortunately he passed away in a tragic accident. Before that, though, he actually was in the NBA. He was getting minutes for the New Orleans Pelicans, and I was very proud of him for that. So I have Bryce DeJean-Jones as an honorable mention. And the last honorable mention I have, this was so hard to put this kid as an honorable mention and not in the top 10 because I had him listed as my number one favorite Rebel of all time, and that's Dedan Thomas Jr. So the reason I have him honorable mention is because I'm really only going off of his freshman year. And can you really say that 18-year-old freshman Dedan Thomas Jr. was a top 10 best player in the last 14 years? Maybe. I've hyped him up so much that you would think that I would definitely have him on that list, but I kept him off because his name didn't pop up in any of the advanced stats. Actually, I lied. I think there was one stat he was on. Oh, so he was top 10 all-time assist percentage, okay? And assist percentage it's different than just total assists, okay? It's basically a more in-depth analysis of like how good you are at getting assists without really explaining it too much further. But yeah, so I have Dedan Thomas as an honorable mention. All right, now let's get into the top 10. Coming in at number 10 on the top 10 greatest players UNLV basketball since 2010, I have Chase Standback. The reason I have Chase Standback so high, and the reason I have him ahead of those players, those aforementioned players that were more talented, is because he was a very experienced player. He was his best year was his senior year. He averaged 13 points, 6 rebounds, 1.5 assists, and 45% from the three-point line. He was a lights-out shooter. He also was a good defender, okay? He was a good defender. He was 6'8". He had great size, so you could play him at multiple positions. His true position was small forward, but because of his size, he could play power forward. He's a type of player that you could fit on almost any roster ever. Those are my favorite kind of players, the guys that are so versatile. They're team guys. They can play multiple positions. They can shoot. They can defend. Those are the type of guys that you can fit on almost any starting five. And that was Chase Standback. So I do think he's underrated in terms of how he's viewed in his career. That's why I have him in the top 10. So Chase was, in the advanced stats, he was two of the top four. He had two of the top four performances in school history in three-pointers made. So he hit 9 three-pointers in a game, and he hit 8 three-pointers in a game. He was also top 10 all-time in steal percentage. Okay, so he got a lot of steals despite the fact that he was known to be a shooter, right? Okay, coming in at number 9, Christian Wood. Very, very talented, 6'10", versatile, could score in a variety of ways. He was athletic. He's currently on the Los Angeles Lakers, and he's had actually a pretty good NBA career, a lot better career than people were expecting him to have. So his stats, his sophomore year. So this is sophomore year Chris Wood, right? And he averaged 15.7 points, 10 rebounds, 1.3 assists, and just under 3 blocks per game. Chris was he pretty much dominated strictly off his talent level. Like he could have been so much better than he was, but he based on his talent level and the stats that he did put up, I had to put him on here. So he was number 4 all-time player efficiency rating. So number 4 all-time in school history. He was also top 10 all-time in offensive rebounds and offensive rebound percentage. So the guy was a very good player, and he could do so much to help the team win. Coming in at number 8, Anthony Marshall, one of my all-time favorite Rebels, Vegas native. I've known of this dude going way back to before his Rebel days because we went to rival high schools. This guy was just a combo guard. He was very good defensively, strong, athletic. He had a lot of talent. He was a 4-star recruit out of high school. It was hard to pick which year to say was his best year, but I went with his junior year where he averaged actually, I think I messed that up. So I think I have his stats from his senior year, or I have his points per game for his senior year, but I have his assists for his junior year. So whatever. In his junior and senior year, he averaged roughly 11 points per game, five rebounds, 6 assists, something around there. So he had really good stats. In terms of his advanced stats, he had the third best defensive plus minus of all time. So he was a very valuable defensive player, and he was number 2 all time in assist percentage. So even though he wasn't known to be a true point guard, the advanced stats said he was a very good passer, and then he was also a very good, very valuable defender. So just a winner and just a great player, one of my all-time favorites. Love Anthony Marshall. He's number 8. Number 7, I have Elijah Harkless. Elijah Harkless was on Kevin Kruger's second year in 22-23. He put up monster numbers. 19 points per game, 4.8 rebounds, 2.6 assists, and 1.6 steals. Harkless was a just stat machine. He was really dominant. You know, it's unfortunate that he had such an awesome year on a team that was quite disappointing. We started the season off 10-0, looking like this was going to be an NCAA tournament team, and then we just struggled mightily in conference. But Elijah did not struggle. He dominated. So, you know, it would have been nice to see what he could have done on a better team. But since the guy was such a good scorer and played really good defense, had to put him on this list. So Elijah was 5th all-time free throws made in a season. So he was also top 10 player efficiency rating and top 10 offensive plus minus all-time UNLV history. So got him in at number 7. Number 6, is one of the most talented players in the history of the program. People tend to, like, when they hear this name, they kind of scoff a bit. Because of how poorly his NBA career went and how much of a bust he was, they kind of think that he sucked. But if you go look at advanced stats, you'll see that he did not suck whatsoever. He was actually quite dominant, and that's Anthony Bennett. Anthony Bennett was our superstar, 5-star, highest-rated recruit in school history. He played the 2012-2013 season where he averaged 16 points, 8 rebounds, and 1 assist. So Anthony Bennett was tied for second most offensive rebounds in a season. He had 9. He had the 4th best plus minus ever in school history. So plus minus is essentially, it's what the score was when you went in the game, what the score was when you went out of the game. And he was, statistically, he was very, very valuable for us, as demonstrated by the fact that he was the 4th best plus minus ever. He was number 8 all-time defensive rebound percentage, number 1 all-time efficiency rating. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. He was number 1 all-time player efficiency rating, which means he was very, very efficient with his scoring the ball when he was in the game. And then he was top 10 all-time in win shares. If you don't know what win shares are, Google it. I'm not going to get into that right now, but it just means how many games you won, essentially, with how valuable you were. Okay, number 5, a name that's going to surprise some people, a name that isn't talked about enough, maybe the most underrated Rebel in history, Trayvon Willis. Okay, so why do I have Trayvon Willis as the number 5 overall player in the last 14 years? Why do I have Trayvon Willis over super talents like Anthony Bennett, Christian Wood, Bryce DeJon-Jones, Rashad Vaughn? It's because he had unbelievable advanced stats. So Trayvon Willis was the number 1 plus minus of all time. Okay, so he was the most valuable player based on plus minus statistics of all time. He had the 7th best defensive plus minus of all time. So just strictly defense, 7th best all time. He was 7th all time in free throws made in a season, 4th all time in free throw percentage in a season. He was number 2 in the history of the school in offensive win shares, number 6 all time in player efficiency rating, number 10 in steal percentage, and then top 10 in win shares. So his name was popping up on almost all of these top 10 advanced stats lists, which was really incredible. Just a very tough, gritty player. He was brilliant at getting to the free throw line. If he was just had a little bit, he was just a little bit undersized and not super athletic, which is why his ceiling wasn't an NBA player. But if he had a little bit more raw talent, he easily could have been a good NBA player. But he was the type of guy that dominates in college, but just doesn't have the overall talent and giftedness to make it to the next level. Okay, so that was number 5. Number 4, a player who was arguably the greatest scorer in UNLV history, at least the greatest scorer post-Hark. You can make that argument. Bryce Hamilton. He also made my list of the top 10 favorite players ever. This guy was just a walking bucket. He was so unstoppable scoring the ball. It's so nice having a player like him on your team, just to have a go-to guy when it's a close game in a very tough environment. You're playing against a really good defensive team. It's a huge game on the line. To have that player that you can just give the ball and just say, go to work. Go get us a bucket. And that's what Bryce did. So in 21-22, that was his senior year. That was his best season. He averaged 22 points per game, 5 rebounds, 2 assists. Okay, an absolutely electrifying scorer in Bryce Hamilton. So he has the most points in a game record all time with 42. He's 9th all time in 3-point percentage, which was surprising because my memory was that he wasn't that good of a shooter. But I guess I was wrong. He was 7th all time in win shares, number 8 all time points total in a season, and then he had 3 of the top 4 all time usage percentage, which means the ball was in his hands like the entire time. 3 of the top 4 all time. So that just speaks to how valuable he was and how much trust Kruger had in him, that he had the ball in his hands that much. Okay, number 3, sophomore year Mike Moser. So anyone that remembers Dave Rice's first year remembers how incredible Mike Moser was that season. He was so dominant that his name was popping up on NBA mock drafts. I mean, he was a nationally recognized name. He was a candidate as an All-American. Just an unbelievable performance his sophomore year, coming out of a redshirt year, transferring from UCLA. And I don't know what happened. He fell off after that. He was joining Anthony Bennett, Kem Birch, Bryce DeJon-Jones, this really talented team with a really talented front court the following year. And he was supposed to be one of our stars, one of our main guys, and the most talented UNLV team since Tarkanian. And then it was like, I remember thinking, God, he's trying too hard to be like a small forward, because that's like kind of where we had to start him in order to get our best players on the floor together. But it just wasn't him. Like, he was launching threes. He was trying to do too much guard stuff. And it kind of took away from what made him so incredible his sophomore year, which was more of an undersized big man who just does all the little things. He was kind of like a Dennis Rodman type player, right? So Moser's advanced stats were incredible. So he was 3 of the top 5 games ever for steals in a game. So 3 of the top 5 ever performances for steals in a game belongs to Mike Moser. Unbelievable. He had 21 rebounds in a game on January 25th, 2012. He is the 5th best defensive plus-minus all-time, 2nd all-time defensive rebound percentage, 5th all-time win shares, top 10 in steal percentage, and top 10 total rebound percentage. Okay, one of the best seasons in UNLV history was Mike Moser's sophomore year, which is why I have him 3 on this list. Okay, number 2, Kem Birch. Kem Birch, definitely one of the more talented players we've had ever. He was a phenomenal defensive player, incredible athlete. Even though he was a big man, he was the fastest player on the team. The dude runs like a gazelle, which led to him having an NBA career. It would have been awesome to see him come back for his senior year, but it made sense why he left. It really did make sense. They figured he would develop more at the time it was called the D League. They thought he would develop more there than having a senior year at UNLV. Which is not wrong, but it was depressing seeing him go, because I think about senior Kem Birch playing alongside a sophomore Christian Wood, and oh my goodness, that would have been terrifying for the opposition. But Kem Birch, on top of that talent, he maybe had the best of any player in UNLV history advanced stats. So he was number 1 all-time block percentage, number 2 all-time in blocks per game, number 1 all-time total blocks, number 1 all-time block percentage. Oh, I had that one on there twice. My bad. So he was tied for most rebounds of all time with 22, tied for first all-time offensive rebounds with 10, second best defensive plus-minus of all time, number 2 all-time player efficiency rating, number 2 all-time offensive rebounds in a season, number 1 all-time offensive rebound percentage. So you could tell, like, just he was extremely dominant just based off of advanced statistics. Absolutely love Kem Birch. You know, he was really fun to watch, and he's had a really good NBA career as well. And okay, now number 1, the guy that I ranked as the best player since 2010 to put on a UNLV basketball uniform, Pat McCaw, which sounds crazy to say, right? Because he was a 3-star recruit out of high school, and what he would end up being, like, no one saw that coming, which is why I had him number 1 on an episode I recorded, the top 5 most surprising players in UNLV history. So, like, pleasant, surprising players that were better than they were expected to be. I had him number 1 ever, because no one saw that coming, how good he would end up being, and then end up being an NBA draft pick. So why do I have him number 1? All right, well, first of all, his stats his sophomore year, he averaged 15 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 2.5 steals. He shot 37% from 3, and he was nearly 50% field goal percentage. So unbelievable stats. His advanced stats, he had the most steals in a game in history with 7. He had most defensive rebounds in a game with 16. He wasn't even a big man. He was a guard. Yet he had the most defensive rebounds ever in a game with 16. He had the 7th best plus-minus ever, number 6 all-time in steals in a season, number 4 all-time steals per game, top 10 steal percentage in 2 different seasons, and top 10 in win shares. Okay, so talent-wise, he was awesome because he got drafted into the NBA, and then statistically, he was incredible. He had the best advanced stats of all time next to Kem Birch and Larry Johnson. But also on top of all of those reasons, he was just the ultimate glue guy. He was extremely versatile. He could play with a 1, he could play the 2, he could play the 3, he could play the 4 because he was 6'7". Okay, he could score in a variety of ways. He could shoot the 3. He could defend very well. He was like Jalen Hill on steroids. That's how good Pat McCaw was. And he was getting minutes for arguably the greatest team of all time in the Golden State Warriors when they won their championships. He was contributing and getting minutes in the NBA Finals to that team when he was only 21 years old or whatever he was. So, I mean, that in itself explains how good he was. It's a shame that we had a player of that caliber, same with Kem Birch, on a team that couldn't make it to the NCAA tournament. We've just had such talented, amazing players since 2010 that, you know, didn't get to experience the success in college basketball that they should have. So that's it. That's my top 10. Again, number 10, Chase Stanback. Number 9, Christian Wood. Number 8, Anthony Marshall. Number 7, Elijah Harkless. Number 6, Anthony Bennett. Number 5, Trayvon Willis. Number 4, Bryce Hamilton. Number 3, Mike Moser. Number 2, Kem Birch. And number 1, Patrick McCaw. Thanks for listening, everyone.